Tonight I'll start with a question. Could you imagine what it would be like if one day your partner left for work, and simply never came back? And now imagine that it's the Middle Ages. There's no police. No search party. No one to ask. You're alone. With children. In the winter. And no one, not the church, not your neighbors, will even call you a widow. And like so many women even now, she kept hoping. Long after everyone else had stopped asking. That's the story I'm telling tonight. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. So let this story carry you. And if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. Now let us begin with the last morning she ever saw him. They had lived in that house for nearly 9 years, not much more than a timber frame, daub walls, and a sloping thatch roof that always leaked a little near the corner where the chickens liked to huddle. It was small, but it had held them through marriage, through the births of 3 children, and through 6 winters, some harsher than others. She was 31, though in her village, that was already considered aging, especially for a woman with children and a husband who often had to leave for seasonal work. The children were 6, 4, and barely toddling, a boy and 2 girls, with cheeks always smudged from ashes or jam or both. Their home stood near the edge of a forest track in the north of England, far from any city, far from anything that might provide answers quickly when life went suddenly sideways. Their days were a rhythm of chores and small satisfactions. Mending hems by candlelight. Feeding chickens who never laid enough. Digging shallow furrows in stubborn earth. He hunted when he could, bartered when he had to, and mended tools for neighbors in exchange for root vegetables and gossip. She dried herbs, churned butter, and told stories in the evenings when the fire was kind enough not to spit smoke back in her face. Between them, they had just enough skills to feed 5 mouths and keep a roof from sagging inward. Nothing more. But not much less, either. It was late autumn of the year 1346. The wheat had come in thinner than expected, the turnips were rotting too soon, and the orchard had yielded more worms than apples. The harvest, they said, had been lean, which, in truth, meant that everyone was being very polite about being quietly afraid. The firewood pile behind the house was nearly high enough to last the winter, but not quite. Most families measured the season by how many carts of wood were stacked under Torp by All Hallows Day. The old men said you needed 4 cords to survive a mild winter. 5, if you were unlucky. That year, most families had 3 and pretended not to worry. Some resorted to gathering animal dung or peeling bark for kindling. Others took down old furniture. There were even stories of families pulling thatch from abandoned barns to use as tinder, the smell of scorched hay giving away their desperation. The morning he left, frost had already touched the edges of the pond near the chapel. She had woken early to pack him bread with dried onions and a scrap of salted pork wrapped in linen. He had woken stiff, as always, from sleeping on straw and creaking floorboards, but he kissed each of the children with his usual worn tenderness. She tied his cloak herself, looping it over his shoulder and adjusting the clasp twice, though it didn't need adjusting. He told her it would only be a few weeks. Maybe a month or 2, at most. There was word of work rebuilding a bridge 2 towns south, decent coin, warm beds, men needed. He promised to return before the lambs were born. She believed him, because in their life, belief wasn't optional. It was what you did with your hands when they weren't holding tools. The baby had a fever that day. The second girl wouldn't let go of his hand. The eldest boy stood outside and watched him walk until he was swallowed by the bend in the road, the one past the mill, where the path splits east toward the river and west toward the fields. She watched too, from the threshold. Then she went back inside, stirred the ashes, and began her mourning. And that was all. The first few days passed in a blur of habit. Bread had to be made. Water hauled. The goat milked. The children calmed. The hearth swept. The ash sifted. And always, someone needed something. A new sock. A missing lid. A story, because they were scared to sleep alone. There was no time to panic. No luxury for worry. And besides, he said he'd be back before the lambing. Before the snow froze the morning water bucket. Before the chimney began to weep moisture in long, sorrowful trails. And so she believed him. At dusk, she lingered near the path. Not idling, she was never idle, but peeling vegetables in sight of the road. Listening. Half working, half hoping, always aware of the hush that fell before footsteps. Her husband had a particular gait. She told herself she would know the sound, even through frost. 1 week has passed. Then 2. The barley ran low. She crushed acorns into the flour and told the children it was the nutty kind of bread. They didn't like it, but they chewed. Because that's what children did when their mother said it was good for them. The goat gave less milk. The chicken stopped laying. The youngest child, still soft in the cheeks and prone to sticky fingers, asked almost every day, "Will Papa be home for supper?" She always said yes. And then gave them his portion. By the 2nd month, the frost had taken the upper edge of the doorway. The smoke from the hearth curled low and stubborn, stinging their eyes. She tied cloths over the children's mouths to help them breathe. Her hands cracked from chopping wet wood, but she didn't wince. Wincing wouldn't split kindling. Some mornings, she borrowed the neighbor's axe. Some mornings, she used her teeth to yank splinters. And all the while, she kept listening. Now and then, someone came by, a peddler, a cousin, a boy with a scroll to deliver. She'd ask, always trying to sound casual, whether they'd seen a man with a crooked tooth and a limp on his left side. One who smiled too often for no reason, and never carried money in his front pocket. No one had. Still, she placed his bowl at supper. Technically, it wasn't wasted. The eldest usually took it. But it sat there anyway, as if the shape of his absence needed a place to rest. Historically, she wasn't alone. Not even remotely. By the middle of the 14th century, thousands of men left their villages each winter to seek labor elsewhere. Road work, stone hauling, river dredging, castle ditches, farmhands, forest clearing, or, for the less fortunate, military hire. The crown required a steady stream of men for its endless expansions, and local lords often conscripted laborers en masse, especially in lean years. Some did it for coins. Some for pride. Some just wanted out. And while a few returned home, many never did. Some died of illness on the road. Some were conscripted into foreign wars. Others started second lives in towns far enough away that no questions were asked. Remarriage wasn't tracked across parishes. No registry followed a man's vows from one chapel to the next. There was no medieval HR department flagging bigamy or desertion. And so, many women were left like this, not truly wives, not technically widows. And that distinction mattered. Because to be a widow in the 14th century, officially, was a legal category. It came with specific rights. A widow had claims to her dower, a portion of her husband's estate. She could, in some places, remarry without the same approval needed the first time. She could make modest legal contracts, inherit tools, hold on to livestock, even petition for small landholdings. But if your husband had simply vanished, if he had not been seen, and not been confirmed dead, you were not a widow. You were just a woman waiting. A wife in name only, bound to a man no longer present, with no way to move forward and no permission to grieve. The church demanded certainty. No corpse meant no mass. The wife should remain hopeful, dutiful, and devoted. In fact, many priests advised patients for 7 years before acknowledging the possibility of widowhood. 7 years of uncertainty. 7 years of he may yet return. 7 years of answering the same question in your head: what if he comes home tomorrow, and I've stopped waiting? Which, incidentally, is not unlike how some women are still expected to carry heartbreak. Probably you've seen it. Someone gets ghosted, or abandoned, or quietly erased. And still, she's told to hold space. To stay soft. To be understanding. And so she waited. By the 3rd month, Her youngest stopped asking about the father. But she kept looking down the road. Every time the wind moved just right, every knock on the shutters, every distant hoofbeat, her breath caught. Her hands paused. And then, it passed. The feeling. The hope. The cold pressed in through the roof beams. The woodpile shrank. And still, she said nothing. Because silence is what you do when you don't want pity, only proof. By the end of the 4th month, there was no longer time to wait at the window. The winter crept into everything, into the gaps between the stones, into the marrow of her bones, into the breath that fogged the shuttered panes. There were still animals to tend, soup to stretch, children to keep warm. And no one was coming back to help. The firewood, once her husband's domain, was now hers. She learned how to stack it properly so it would dry without molding, how to split it without wasting a swing. She burned through what they had gathered together by mid-December, then went out alone to find what she could before the snow made it impossible. She wore 2 dresses at once and lined her shoes with hay. On days she couldn't carry enough on her back, she dragged it in bundles behind her through the frost-bitten fields. The animals needed mending too. Harnesses, gate hinges, chicken coops, and troughs didn't wait for spring. He had always fixed them with twine, bone pins, and clever knots. She did what she could with bent nails and borrowed tools. And when nothing worked, she improvised. A sackcloth curtain became a gate. A broken cart became firewood. A rusty hinge was reproposed into a lock for the pantry. There was no glory in this work. But it held the family together. Some days she had to lift her skirts to do what no one thought a woman should. Unjam a plough blade, butcher a lame pig, or climb to the roof to fix a hole before the sleet returned. And after all of that, after doing his work, and hers, and what felt like everyone's, she still had to rise before dawn to knead bread with cold hands and hang laundry stiff as bark. She hadn't meant to become the village cobbler. But after fixing her son's boots with layers of old wool and waxed thread, and then being asked by a neighbor to do the same, it became its own quiet trade. She never asked for a coin. But if someone left a loaf of barley bread on the windowsill in return, she didn't object. It was how many women survived, not with titles or pay, but in the unspoken system of barter that existed between those who had just enough, and those who didn't. There was talk, of course. Not cruel, exactly. But knowing. The kind of comments that slipped into conversation like a thorn under a sleeve. Still wearing his boots, I see. She's doing well, considering. She must know he's gone by now. And yes, she knew what they meant. But unlike the stories of women today, when the world demands explanations, and they can most times dismiss judgments because what happens in their lives is none of anyone's business, difficult, this woman knew better than to answer. In a time without privacy, silence was a kind of armor. She simply kept going. This woman, unlike women today who can often dismiss judgment and defy demands for explanation, knowing their lives are their own business, understood the power of silence. In an age without privacy, silence was her shield. She simply pressed on. The priest once suggested she might join the women who lit votives daily in prayer for wandering husbands. But she declined. Quietly. Respectfully. She still believed, she said. She just believed differently now. The children no longer asked at bedtime. They no longer looked toward the road. They watched their mother instead. And when she wept once while stirring the soup, no one spoke. Her grief was not performative. It was practical. It wore an apron. And in a way that's hard to explain to someone who's never had to bear the weight of a vanished life, she moved forward. Not out of hope, and not out of despair. But because the bread would not bake itself. Because the cow needed turning. Because the days were too short for longing. And because, though she could not admit it aloud, there was something easier about the routine. Something honest about the pain. Something familiar about loneliness, once she gave it a name. In the eyes of the church, she was still married. There had been no funeral. No final rites. No burial procession. Just an absence that no one could legally name. Because her husband had disappeared, not died, she wasn't permitted to call herself a widow. Not officially. Not out loud. She was what canon law called spes relicta, a wife in waiting. Bound by the sacrament of marriage until death did them part, and yet no one could prove the parting. So she waited. Not just for his footsteps at dusk, or his voice at the door, but for permission to move forward. For someone, anyone, to declare what she already knew. That he was gone. That he was not coming back. But without a body, there was no proof. And without proof, there was no widowhood. That meant she could not remarry. Could not reclaim her dowry. Could not seek protection in another man's household. Could not wear black or be seen mourning in public, because to do so would be admitting something the church had not granted her permission to admit. And in a world where mourning was ritual, where the absence of certain colors or veils marked you as a woman in limbo, her silence was not seen as dignified. It was seen as suspicious. She couldn't move. Not to another cottage. Not to another man's hearth. Not to a different parish. She was stuck. Suspended. A question with no answer. The word they used was hopeful. Hopeful that he was alive. Hopeful that he was simply delayed. Hopeful that, at any moment, the door would creak open and he'd step inside, brushing the snow from his cloak. But hope, in this case, wasn't kindness. It was control. A binding rope in the form of a virtue. Because hopeful women waited. Hopeful women stayed chaste. Hopeful women did not petition bishops. Or take lovers. Or speak of grief that had not been authorized. And when you've spent months hauling water, splitting kindling, bartering for flour, and waking up cold in a bed that was once shared, being told to stay hopeful starts to sound like a joke. A cruel one. Still, she tried. She followed the rules. Wore the same apron. Lit the same candles. Said the same evening prayers, each time pretending not to notice the empty space beside her. But the village noticed. Or rather, stopped noticing. At first, they asked politely, "Any word from your husband?" Perhaps the snows delayed him. Then, a few months later, the question stopped. And the glances changed. People avoided her in the market. Neighbors offered fewer greetings. One woman clutched her child a little closer, as if misfortune were contagious. After all, no one wanted to get too close to a woman who didn't fit into a box. She wasn't married. She wasn't widowed. She wasn't spoken for. That made people uncomfortable. And it made her dangerous. In a culture built on categories, wife, widow, maiden, mother, an unnamed woman was an error. A frightening uncertainty. There was, of course, a legal process. Canon law required a waiting period of at least 7 years before a woman could be declared widowed by absence. Sometimes longer, if the husband had left for war or pilgrimage. In rare cases, if she had the right connections, she could petition a bishop to shorten the wait. But this often involved formal testimony, witnesses, and letters sent all the way to Rome. Some women tried. They filed petitions, though not on their own. They sought out notaries, neighbors who could vouch for their husband's disappearance, local clergy willing to draft statements. A few paid scribes to compose formal appeals, letters written in Latin, full of humble phrases and flourishes, begging for permission to remarry, to grieve, to move on. But those were wealthier women. Women who could afford ink and parchment, or who had cousins in clerical robes, or at least knew which door to knock on in the next town. This woman didn't. She was a peasant. She didn't know how to read, and she certainly didn't know how to write. Her life was measured in bread dough and milking times, not in lines of script. So instead of writing letters, she did laundry. She hauled the stained linens to the riverbank, scrubbed until her knuckles split, and came home to the same empty hearth, day after day, with nothing to show for her loyalty but blisters and silence. And hope, in her case, was not comfort. It was not the gentle suggestion of something good still possible. It was control, repackaged as virtue. It was obedience tied up in ribbons of faith. A binding rope made out of moral expectation. Because hopeful women waited. Hopeful women stayed chaste. Hopeful women did not make noise, did not ask for more, did not presume to name themselves widows without approval. She learned to do her husband's work, even when it meant lifting her skirts, quite literally, and hoisting buckets of compost from the latrine pit. This was considered improper, of course. A woman wasn't supposed to hike her skirts above her ankles in public. It showed too much. Suggested she wasn't modest. That she'd lost her place. But when the cows hadn't been milked and the firewood was still wet and her son's cough wouldn't stop, modesty became a luxury she couldn't afford. And yet, even as she strained her back pulling plows and balanced baskets atop her head, there were those who still questioned her. Isn't she a little too strong now? Strange, how quickly she's managed without him. As if survival itself were an accusation. As if moving forward, even slightly, were a betrayal of the man who left her behind. And the worst part? Some women would have given anything to be in her place. Because at least she hadn't seen him die. At least she didn't have to bury him with her own hands. Or carry the fever home from the city. Or watch his face turn pale as ash while the priest mumbled prayers that couldn't stop the coughing. Some women envied her. Believed she was lucky. But luck, in this case, was a quiet agony. It was the ache of not knowing. The limbo of half-loss. Some endings come loudly. With shouting, with doors slammed, with letters and signatures and friends taking sides. But others arrive like fog. Soft. Unannounced. Invisible at first, until one day, you realize you've been living inside it for some time. This was one of those endings. No one in the village declared her a widow. She didn't wear black. There was no funeral. No final word. And certainly, no release. But in her own small way, in the privacy of her kitchen hearth, she found a way to let go. Not of him, but of the waiting. It began on an ordinary morning. The kind where the frost clings to the shutters, and the kettle takes forever to boil. She had meant to light the fire quickly, get the porridge going. But instead, she stood still for a moment, holding a torn scrap of linen. It had once been a sleeve. Mended 3 times already. Now too worn to fix again. She couldn't write but she knew the shape of his name, not in letters, but in loops. She'd seen it once, years before, on a borrowed letter from a traveling monk. And she remembered it the way some people remember faces, loosely, but with feeling. So, with slow fingers and uneven stitches, she marked the cloth not with letters, but with the idea of him. A symbol only she could read. A name spelled in memory, not in ink. The thread was dark and the cloth was pale. She folded it tightly, bound it with flax, and tucked it into a narrow space behind the chimney bricks. Then she lit the fire anyway. The gesture wasn't grand. But it was final. She didn't say goodbye. There was no whispered prayer. Just the sound of kindling catching, and the smell of peat smoke curling up into the air. And with it, the memory of a man who had once promised to return before the lambs were born. She kept his boots by the door. Not because she thought he'd need them, but because they made good insulation. She lined them with straw and stuck them in the corner to block the draft. Practical. Efficient. Not sentimental. And maybe, in a way, that was the most honest grief of all. In similar situations, with missing husbands, some women would cut their hair, which was a symbol of mourning, but also of ownership. In many places, a married woman's hair belonged, symbolically, to her husband. Letting it fall was an act of grief, and of quiet rebellion. Especially if she let it grow wild afterward, or tucked it under a scarf without braiding it properly, the kind of small social signal that said, "No one else touches this now." Others went to the priest and said they'd had a vision. Claimed the Virgin Mary had whispered their husband's fate in a dream. That a crow had appeared at the window and refused to leave. That the candle wouldn't stay lit, or wouldn't go out. Sometimes, that was enough to earn them sympathy. Other times, it was just one more reason to be watched. Some claimed their husbands had died in battle, even when they hadn't. It was hard to verify. The 100 Years' War had begun and mercenaries moved constantly. Records were poor. A man could vanish on a Tuesday and be rumored dead by Friday, or remarried in another parish by the following Lent. And so, some women made up deaths. Invented skirmishes. These women would cry at funerals that hadn't happened, just to get the rights that only a widow could claim, to inherit a bit of land, to remarry, to be seen as whole again. One woman, a shepherd's wife, had taken her husband's wool cloak down to the river and hurled it in with a stone tied to the hem. She said it was the will of the saints. That she'd been told, in trance, to let it go and that the river would carry his soul to peace. It didn't. The village gossip said he'd been seen 2 towns over with a brewer's daughter and a new pair of boots. But no one confronted her. The story was too beautiful. And by then, she was already calling herself a widow. None of it was legal and most of it wasn't true. But all of it was real. Because when grief has no script, people write their own. But she didn't do any of that. She didn't ask for permission, or forgiveness, or answers. She simply carried on. Because no one else was going to pull the water, tend the goat, salt the fish, braid the girl's hair, and mend the cracked spindle. The baby still cried. And the beans still needed soaking. And she was still here. Living. Even if no one called her a widow. Even if they barely called her anything at all. There is the widow you see in paintings. Black veil, lowered eyes, the slow descent into mourning after a death announced with certainty. And then, there is another kind. The kind we've been speaking of. Not every widow buries a body. Some bury the waiting, quietly, bit by bit. In the 14th century, the church had rules, as always. A woman could only be declared a widow if her husband's death was confirmed. That meant a witness, a body, a burial, or, in some cases, a confession on a deathbed that had reached the ears of a priest. But most men didn't die on beds. They died in the dirt. In battlefields with no name. In forests on the road between towns. In ditches during cold nights, with no one to carry news home. And so the women they left behind remained in a strange category, neither married nor unwed. Their hearts belonged to someone. But legally, they belonged to no one. They were called chaste widows. It was considered virtuous, even holy. The church praised it as the highest form of widowhood. No remarriage, no new entanglements, just silent devotion to a husband who might, or might not, still be breathing. In sermons, these women were compared to saints. In practice, they were ignored. There was the mother whose son had been conscripted in a local feud, promised safe return before the barley harvest. That was 8 seasons ago. She still tied a black ribbon to the door on his birthday, and swept out his corner of the hearth every morning. Another woman, married to a tanner with debts, had watched her husband leave quietly one dawn to avoid arrest. She told the neighbors he'd gone to negotiate with a cousin. After a year, she stopped telling them anything. But she kept his boots by the door, because moving them felt like a betrayal. One had lost her husband to a raiding party. Traders came through in spring, tempers flared. No one saw him after that. There were rumors of a body by the river, but when she went to look, it was already gone. She never spoke of it again. But she never touched the bedding on his side of the pallet. These women stayed in their homes, kept their heads covered, and their voices soft. They spun thread, mended things and watched the road. Laughed politely on feast days. But they knew, in the center of their chests, that their story had stopped moving forward. They were asked to be virtuous. And patience, they were told, was a virtue. So they waited, and while they waited, time moved on without them. They weren't permitted to call themselves widows. But they lived like them. And in many ways, it was lonelier than grief. The strange thing is, she never told anyone she'd stopped waiting. Not even her children. They just noticed, one day, that she no longer looked at the road when footsteps passed. She still listened, out of habit. But her hands didn't pause. Her breath didn't catch. She simply kept sewing, or stirring, or stacking kindling near the hearth. Over time, things changed, slowly, and without ceremony. The older children began to help more. The youngest learned to tie their own shoes, and carry buckets half full instead of always emptying them along the way. She stopped pretending he'd be back in time for planting, or harvest, or the feast of St. Bridget. She stopped marking the door frame with little notches, one for each season he missed. There were still hard winters, but also some that passed more gently. There were quiet mornings where the chores got done before the bread burned. Moments when laughter returned, in small, careful doses. One of the girls learned to sing while she swept. One of the boys figured out how to trade eggs for shoe leather at the edge of the forest path. Life didn't exactly get easier, but it stopped feeling like a punishment. She even began to hum again, very softly, while churning butter. A habit from girlhood she thought she'd forgotten. No one ever said his name aloud. Not anymore. But when someone dropped a sack of flour with a sound like a heavy boot at the threshold, she still turned toward the door, just for a second. Then went back to kneading. In time, people stopped calling her hopeful. Stopped expecting her to remarry. Stopped suggesting that perhaps he'd found work in another village. They didn't say much at all. And maybe that was a mercy. Because she no longer needed their questions or their comfort. She had a new routine now. Not the one she chose, but the one she built, brick by invisible brick, out of sheer necessity. And it held. Even now, there are women who grieve what they cannot name. Not every widow buries a body. Some bury the waiting. Some fold it away, like winter clothes, too heavy to wear, too painful to discard, and they keep going. They learn to plow, and patch, and mend, and measure. They learn to live without asking, what if? And when someone asks how they managed, they often just smile, and say, you do what you have to do. But the truth is simpler. They survived. Because they had no choice. And because someone had to make sure the firewood got stacked before snow. Had this story been different if we were not talking about a peasant woman? What if the same man had disappeared, but the woman he left behind wore velvet instead of wool? Let's imagine that just across the river, in the same region, and in the same year, 1346, a noblewoman stood on her stone balcony and watched her husband ride away. Not on foot, not with a sack of bread on his back, but on horseback, flanked by squires and armed with a letter of commission. Perhaps to oversee a distant manor. Or to advise in some bishop's court. Or, more grimly, to support King Edward's early campaigns in France. And what if he didn't return? Well, the widowhood of a noblewoman was a different kind of silence. Not easier, necessarily, but more visible. More politicized. More strategic. Where a peasant woman disappeared into work, a noblewoman disappeared into protocol. There would have been letters, of course. Seals and scrolls and formal announcements delivered by messengers who never made eye contact. The family chaplain would have lit candles. The steward would have begun the ledgers. The women in the hall would have lowered their voices when she entered. She would be dressed in mourning. Eventually. But only eventually. Because without a body, even among nobles, there were rules. If no soldier returned from the front with news, if no official bore witness, if the battlefield held no named grave, she, too, would be asked to wait. Just like the peasant woman. Except her waiting would be organized. The church would remind her of canon law. Without proof of death, she remained married. Without proof, there could be no inheritance shift. No remarriage. No legal protection for her children's claims. And unlike her peasant counterpart, she would have a great deal to lose if she got it wrong. Noble estates were not simply homes, they were claims. Contracts. The land a noblewoman lived on wasn't necessarily hers. It might be part of her dowry, or held in jointure, or claimed by her husband's cousin if she were no longer deemed his wife. And if she guessed wrong, if she declared herself a widow too soon, she could be accused of fraud. There were cases, documented ones, of noble women losing everything after speaking too early. Land seized. Children disinherited. Even accusations of witchcraft when they dared to know what had happened without a man's confirmation. So, she wouldn't guess. She would perform. She would light candles for his soul, but only in private. She would keep his seal on the household chest. She would continue signing letters as Lady Wife of. She would dine in half-light and wear colors that suggested waiting, but not mourning. And perhaps the cruelest part? Everyone would watch her do it. Unlike the peasant widow, whose grief was ignored, the noblewoman's grief was scrutinized. Managed. Whispered about behind closed doors. Too much sorrow, and she might be unstable. Too little, and she was already choosing her next husband. In fact, noble women were so politically useful as widows, or possible widows, that some were kept in limbo for years. Dowagers of powerful men were occasionally held in legal suspension, with relatives controlling their property until the husband's death could be officially confirmed. Some sent letters to Rome. Some begged Parliament. Others waited quietly until time itself gave them permission. 7 years. That was the common law. 7 years of no news, no witnesses, no body, and then a woman, even a noble one, could apply to be legally recognized as a widow. In rare cases, it took more. Papal dispensation. Royal permission. The cooperation of powerful men with even more powerful families. Because remarriage, for a noble woman, wasn't just emotional. It was territorial. Her womb was land. Her name was a dowry. Her next husband would gain whatever title came with her skirts. So any whisper of impropriety was dangerous. There were, of course, exceptions. Some noble women seized the moment. Especially in the chaos of war. They forged death reports. Paid off messengers. Bribed bishops. Married quickly and hoped the first husband wouldn't come back to ruin everything. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. There's a record of a woman in Yorkshire who married a second time after her night husband went missing in France, only for him to return 3 years later. Her second marriage was annulled. Her children declared illegitimate. Her property contested. She was moved to a convent, quietly. Not punished. But erased. Others were more clever. They never remarried. But they arranged everything else. They named a steward who just happened to live in the West Wing. They gave their daughters away to strategic alliances. They moved their unmarried sisters in. And they let time do the explaining. But the grief? The personal grief? It was rarely mentioned. Because noble women were trained in performance. They knew how to sit still with a straight spine. They knew how to speak of duty, of legacy, of God's will. But they wouldn't talk about loneliness. Not of wondering if the husband was dead, or just chose not to come back. Because even in castles, even in rooms with tapestries and glass windows and imported oils, a woman could still be left behind. And still be asked to wait. And still have no name for what she had become. She never told them she was done waiting. Not her children. Not her neighbors. Not even herself, really. But over time, they noticed she no longer turned her head when footsteps came down the road. She no longer paused when a knock echoed through the village. Her eyes didn't search the tree line anymore. She got through the winter. And the one after that. The children learned how to mend. To carry. To stir the pot when her hands were stiff. By the time her eldest could lift the water bucket without spilling it, life had become, not easy, but possible. She planted onions that spring. Not because she loved onions, though they kept well through the cold, but because it meant she could plan for months ahead. It meant she expected to still be here when the ground thawed again. And somehow, she'd earned that. She didn't need the church's permission to mourn. Or anyone else's approval to begin again. Her grief didn't wear black or speak aloud, but it softened with time, like bread left to rise. Sometimes she still dreamt of him. Dreams where he walked into the house, half smiling, arms full of firewood, as if not a day had passed. She never spoke in those dreams. She only reached for him. And sometimes she woke up crying. Not because he was gone, but because he'd never returned. There's a kind of grief that lives not in the crying, but in the quiet. In the rhythm of chopped roots and boiled broth. In beds made alone. In boots lined with straw because no one else remembered to do it. She never left the village. Never married again. Never had to explain. And that was enough. Because sometimes healing isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't come from closure, or words, or certainty. Sometimes it grows slowly, out of routine, out of kindness, out of nothing at all. And like so many women across so many centuries, she carried it quietly. All the way through. If you're still awake, I hope that by now, you're almost asleep. And maybe, just maybe, you felt the quiet thread that ties us all together, across time, across loss, across the long silences women have carried without witness. Because the truth is, the world may forget their names. But their stories remain. In the fire that still needs lighting. In the chores done alone. In the strength no one claps for, but that keeps everyone warm. Thank you, for spending this evening here. For remembering a woman who was never written down. Script written by Clara Finch, because some stories still deserve a soul. Good night.